Okay, so let's dive right in. When the U.S. Constitution was first put together, it was really built on this pretty revolutionary idea, a federal government that had strictly limited power. Today, we're going to go back to the original blueprints to really get a handle on that foundational principle.
And this really is the central question for our whole discussion today. What were the original intended limits on federal power? I think you'll find the answer is way more specific than you might imagine.
So, before we dig into all the details, we really need to grasp this one core idea that pretty much all the founders agreed on. It was the absolute bedrock of the entire new system.
This right here is the 10th Amendment. And you know, its logic is incredibly direct. If a power wasn't specifically handed over to the new federal government in the Constitution, well then, it just doesn't have that power. Period. It stays with the states, or with the people. It's really that simple. And you've got to understand, this principle wasn't some kind of afterthought they just tacked on with the Bill of Rights. Even before the 10th Amendment was officially ratified, Thomas Jefferson was already calling it the very foundation of the Constitution. It was basically the assumed rule from day one.
I mean, the father of the Constitution himself, James Madison, he couldn't have been any clearer. In Federalist 45, he paints this picture of a small, very specific federal government and these vast, broad state governments. The roles were never meant to be equal in scope, not even close. And to show you just how widespread this idea was, listen to James Wilson, who was one of the very first Supreme Court justices. He put it in the simplest terms imaginable. This wasn't some fringe theory, you see. It was the core sales pitch for getting the Constitution approved. If it's not written down in the document, it's not a federal power.
So, the principle was clear, few and defined powers. But what did that actually mean in practice? Where was the detailed instruction manual that listed out exactly what was in and what was out? Well, for that, we have to meet a pretty important figure.
All right, get ready for this. The man who laid out the most complete vision of federalism for the public, the people who had to vote on this thing, wasn't Madison or Hamilton or Jay. Nope. It was someone most of us never even learn about in school.
His name was Tench Coxe. And here's the kicker. During the whole ratification debate, his essays were actually circulated more widely and were more influential than the now famous Federalist Papers. His whole goal was to draw these clear and permanent lines so there could be absolutely no confusion about where federal power stopped and state power started.
So how'd he do it?
Well, Coxe didn't just talk about principles. He made lists. He gave the public a detailed breakdown of exactly what the new federal government could do, and maybe more importantly, what it absolutely could not do.
So here's the 30,000-foot view he laid out. The federal government? That was for specific national stuff. Think defense, foreign policy. But the state governments, they were for basically everything else, what he called the internal police, and all other matters that touch the day-to-day lives of their citizens.
Okay, so what was completely off limits for the feds? According to Coxe, they had no business at all messing with state courts or local crimes. And get this, the entire machinery of our democracy, things like training the militia, setting voter qualifications, or even running the elections themselves, all of that was meant to be purely state-run.
And that hands-off list just keeps going. The federal government couldn't regulate local commerce, like inspecting produce. It couldn't appoint a single state officer, or even think about altering a state constitution. And this is a huge one. Internal infrastructure, building canals, roads, bridges, that was clearly a state and local job, not some big federal project.
All right, so now let's flip the coin and see what Coxe said was exclusively state territory. We're talking about things like regulating religion, handling inheritance laws, chartering corporations. The key point here is that these core functions of a civil society were explicitly outside the federal government's job description.
And the scope of these reserved state powers was just vast. I mean, think about it. Education, libraries, local infrastructure like wharves and jails, public welfare like hospitals, local police forces, even promoting local businesses, all of it, every bit, fell under those numerous indefinite powers that belong to the states.
These lists are fascinating to look at, but they're not just some historical trivia. They really represent a deep, underlying philosophy about the very nature and purpose of government in the American system.
This right here, this is maybe Coxe's most powerful idea. He argued that the federal and state governments weren't just two levels of the same organization. They weren't partners or equals. No, they were fundamentally different kinds of things, built for completely different purposes.
So here's how Coxe broke that difference down. The federal government, he said, was a union of sovereign states, and it was created for a few special purposes.
things like defense. But the state governments, those were associations of individual people, designed to handle all the general purposes of a society. They were apples and oranges.
So why draw these sharp lines? Why insist they were of different natures? Well, the whole goal was to protect the states. This entire structure was a defense mechanism, designed to prevent exactly what the Anti-Federalists were terrified of, a powerful, centralized government that would eventually just swallow up the states and all their authority.
And so that leaves us with the big question, doesn't it? We've just walked through the original blueprint as it was explained by one of its most influential advocates. The real question for us, right now, is how does that blueprint compare to the government we live with today? And does that original vision still hold any relevance for us?